also a somewhat novel approach to the interpretation of the Qur'an. But before I get to that, I just want to say that that article is really a small part of the project that I'm undertaking. And so I want to sort of give you a sense of the sort of bigger picture into which that article fits. And that's what this slide is about, this opening slide. So this slide has got two paradigms or two ways of thinking about the religious scriptures and the religious traditions. And many of you probably subscribe to the view on the left. So this is the view that has been held by Muslims and Christians for many centuries. So in this view or paradigm, Christianity, mainstream Christianity, as we understand it today, is reflective of the teachings of the gospel accounts of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And Islam, as we know it today, is believed to be reflective of the teachings of the Qur'an. And in addition to that, in this paradigm, Christianity and Islam are irreconcilable. They're not compatible with each other. And the reason that they are incompatible is because the scriptures are incompatible. They can't be reconciled. So that's the way that Muslims and Christians have thought about their religions and their scriptures for quite a long time. And what I'm trying to do is convince you that that paradigm is not right, and the paradigm on the right of the screen is the correct one. And that's a paradigm shift, and paradigm shifts are very difficult, even if you're smart and intelligent, because if you've become accustomed to thinking about something in a certain way, it becomes intuitive. And it's very hard to sort of overcome that and retrain yourself to think in a different way. So I do have my work cut out here. But if we just take a look at this paradigm on the left, it has come under attack in the last couple of hundred years since the Enlightenment period. So, for example, critical historians challenge, the supposed link here between the gospel and Christianity. So, just to sort of give an example of that, the Trinity, the doctrine of the Trinity is part of mainstream Christianity. That's how most Christians understand the gospel accounts. But critical historians have studied the gospel in its historical context. They've looked at early Christian writings, and they've come to a different conclusion. They've concluded that Jesus belonged to the monotheistic tradition of Judaism, and that the Trinity was then developed later. Now, that's the sort of standard historical narrative. If you accept that, it does undermine this supposed link between the gospel and Christianity, and simultaneously, it strengthens the link between the gospel and the Qur'an, because the Qur'an, of course, said 1400 years ago that Jesus was monotheistic and that the Trinity was an invention. Similarly, in the last couple of hundred years, Orientalist scholars have challenged the link or the supposed link between the Qur'an and the Muslim tradition. I won't give you specific examples of that right now, but there are a number of Orientalist scholars who've done that. So what I'm saying is that if you continue that process of contextual study of the scriptures and critical study of the religious traditions, that you end up with this paradigm on the right, which is opposite to the one on the left. Because in this paradigm on the right, the religious traditions are not reflective of the scriptures. They, in fact, impede your understanding of the scriptures. If you really want to understand the scriptures in this paradigm, you have to bypass the traditions altogether and study the scriptures in their historical context. And if you do that, then you will discover that the gospel and the Qur'an are actually consistent. So this is the bigger picture into which the crucifixion article fits, because if I present this paradigm to you, the one on the right, a common objection that Muslims and Christians would raise is, what about the crucifixion? isn't that an issue on which the Gospel and the Qur'an differ? And my answer to that question is no, they do not differ on this point. The crucifixion verse is an example of where Muslim clerics have misunderstood the Qur'an. And if we understand the verse in its context, it is actually consistent with the Gospel. I hope that's clear to everyone. If not, people can sort of raise their hand. So before I move on to the crucifixion verse, I've just got a quick slide about contextual interpretation versus literal interpretation. And I'm using a modern day example here so that people can sort of understand what I'm trying to say. So imagine that you're on social media, on X or Facebook, and you come across a post that says this. The Prime Minister...
Yeah, let's go.
Okay,
I can try and look that.
Imagine you come across a post which says this: the Prime Minister has been crucified by the media. Now, there are different ways of understanding this, but I think most of you, if you came across this sentence, you would understand it to mean that the Prime Minister has been severely criticized by the media. Okay, that's how most of us would understand. I think probably all of us would understand that that's what the writer of this sentence has intended. However, you could interpret it literally. You could take it to mean that a group of reporters has physically executed the Prime Minister by tying him to a cross. I don't think anybody in the room would interpret it that way. If anybody would interpret it that way, please raise your hand. But I doubt that anybody would interpret it that way. And it's worth actually thinking about why you don't interpret it that way. What are the reasons? And it's not just the usage of language, that we're familiar with this kind of usage, but there are actually contextual reasons why you would not read it that way. And I'm just going to give a few examples. So one example would be that crucifixion is not practiced in Britain anymore. People, if someone wanted to assassinate the Prime Minister, it's very unlikely that they would do it in this fashion. And that's a contextual reason why we don't understand this sentence in this way. Another reason would be that the media, generally speaking, does not go around killing people. They can do a lot more harm to a person's reputation by writing horrible things about them. That's the weapon that they use to attack someone. They don't use physical violence. So again, that's a contextual reason. And another reason that I would put forward is that imagine if a group of reporters did actually assassinate the Prime Minister in this way. Imagine what the reaction to that would be. You know, it would be world news. It would be plastered all over the news. I mean, assassinations are a big deal, but an assassination in this brutal way would be talked about for years to come. I mean, you wouldn't expect to come across it in a throwaway comment on social media. So these are reasons that we don't think about when we come across this sentence. We do this automatically. We're not doing this consciously. It's automatic. And the reason it's automatic is because we are immersed in the context of this sentence. We live and breathe 21st century Britain. So for that reason, we immediately know what this sentence means. But now if you imagine someone living 14 centuries in the future, in a very different time and place, coming across a scrap of paper which had this sentence, a scrap of paper from the 21st century with this sentence written on it, now there is a danger that this person might misinterpret the sentence because they have not immersed themselves in the context of that sentence. Unless they study 21st century Britain and understand the historical background to this statement, there is a danger of misinterpretation. And in my opinion, my humble opinion, religious clerics and secular academics do tend towards literal interpretation when it comes to the Qur'an. I think there are a number of reasons for that, historical and other reasons why they do that, but they tend towards literal interpretation rather than contextual interpretation. So if we now go to the crucifixion verse of the Quran, this is Pichthal's translation of the verse, and the phrase that gets people's attention is this one: "They slew him not, nor crucified." This is the sentence that tends to be interpreted literally, that the Jews did not, in fact, put Jesus on a cross and kill him by method of crucifixion. Now, before we actually get to the wider context of this verse, we can see that literal interpretation immediately causes some problems, because the very next phrase is, "But it appeared so unto them." And so this now causes a lot of confusion, because what it means is that the Jews were under the impression that they killed Jesus when in fact they didn't. That's what it would mean in the traditional reading. And to make sense of that, Muslim clerics then come up with substitution theories. They say that, well, it wasn't Jesus who was crucified, it was someone that looked like Jesus, and the Jews mistook him to be Jesus. And that's why they were under this impression that they had killed him when in fact they hadn't. That's the way that one of the ways in which Muslim clerics then deal with this phrase. That's not in the verse. That's something that you are forced to kind of come up with in order to explain what's going on here. But much more problematic than that is this phrase here. This phrase is extremely problematic, because this phrase is saying those who disagree concerning it are in doubt thereof. Those who disagree with what has just been said are in doubt. Now, according to the traditional reading, the verse is saying that the crucifixion of Jesus did not take place as a material event. And that would mean those who disagree are those who think that it did take place. So the traditional reading of this phrase is those people who say that Jesus was in fact crucified are in doubt about this. Now, this is highly problematic. I wonder if I can just use Martin here as a volunteer. But if I were to ask you, Martin, I assume that you believe Jesus was in fact crucified.
Yes.
And so do you have any doubts about that? Do you think that maybe they got the wrong man, or maybe the events didn't happen as described?
No.
No. So thank you, Martin. What Martin has demonstrated there is that this traditional reading doesn't work. So one of the problems with people when they approach this verse is they concentrate on the phrase, "they slew him not." And then they try and come up with, or Muslim clerics try and come up with, holes in the historical narrative. They don't pay attention to this sentence, which is about people who disagree. People like Martin, according to the traditional reading, people like Martin ought to be in doubt. But Martin is not in doubt, and that makes the traditional reading untenable. So I hope that makes sense, and it kind of explains the reason, the sort of motivation for trying to find more satisfactory readings of this verse. So this is my reading. This is in the article. It's very straightforward, very easy to understand. It's not complicated at all. What I'm saying is that the word justly, which in Arabic is bil haq, that's the Arabic word, is implied. It doesn't appear in the Arabic text, but it's implied. And before I talk about the reasons why it's implied, what I want to point out is that once you insert this word, justly, into Pichthal's translation, suddenly, like magic, everything falls into place. It just all starts to make sense. So what it's saying is, they slew him not justly, nor crucified him justly. It's not saying that the crucifixion didn't take place. It's saying that the crucifixion was morally wrong. That's the point that is being made. That the Jews made a moral mistake in crucifying Jesus. And now the rest of the verse is all self-evident and intuitive, because the phrase, but it appeared so unto them, is now quite clear. They did not kill him justly, but it appeared that way to them. It appeared to the Jews that what they were doing was right. No elaboration is required. The phrase is self-evident. It explains itself. And similarly now, the phrase, those who disagree concerning it are in doubt, means those who disagree with this, those who think that Jesus' crucifixion was morally justified, are in doubt. Now, I've used Martin as a volunteer. I don't know if we've got any Jewish participants in the audience. If there is, maybe you can raise your hand. But if not, I would suggest that you do, as I have done, speak to Jews about the morality of the crucifixion. And if you ask your average Jew what he thinks about the morality of the crucifixion, does he think that the crucifixion of Jesus was morally justified? That will give that person pause for thought. They will and ah about that. They will not be certain that Jesus' crucifixion was justified. And this is the doubt that is being referred to in the verse. Now, this doubt is also evident in early Jewish writings. So this passage here is taken from the Talmud. This is what the Talmud, the Jewish Talmud, has to say about the crucifixion of Jesus. I'll just read it out. On the eve of Passover, Jesus the Nazarene was hanged, and a herald went forth before him 40 days, heralding Jesus the Nazarene is going forth to be stoned because he practiced sorcery and instigated and seduced Israel to idolatry. Whoever knows anything in defense may come and state it. But since they did not find anything in his defense, they hanged him on the eve of Passover. Now, there is a significant difference in the description of Jesus's execution in this passage compared to the canonical gospel accounts. Because in the canonical gospel accounts, all four of them, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, it describes that Jesus was arrested at night and he was tried and condemned to death the very same night and then executed the next day. And so everything happened very quickly. Within less than 24 hours, Jesus was arrested and executed. In this passage, it has this 40-day period in which Jesus and his followers were given the opportunity to defend Jesus against the charges that were made against him. And it says that no one presented a defense. Does anybody have any comments about why there is this major discrepancy in the two accounts? Why do you think this passage is describing a 40-day opportunity for Jesus to defend himself when nothing of that nature is in the gospel accounts? I don't know if anybody's written something in the chat, but I will answer the question otherwise in that case. So this is in my view, this is a fabrication. This story doesn't really make sense because Jesus would not have arrived in Jerusalem for the Passover 40 days before. He would have arrived a few days before. It doesn't make sense that there was this 40-day period before his execution. And of course, it contradicts the multiply attested accounts that we have in the New Testament. So the question then is, why would a Jewish author invent something like this? And my answer to that is that the Jewish author is trying to absolve the Jewish clergy of moral responsibility for Jesus's crucifixion. He's trying to make them look less bad. He's trying to say, well, Jesus was given ample opportunity to defend himself, and he didn't. And it's only after 40 days that he was executed. And the only possible motivation for inventing a story like that is recognition that the crucifixion of Jesus it does not look good. It is very difficult to defend morally. And so this is the sort of moral doubt that the Qur'an is referring to in this verse. And so what I just want to demonstrate before I talk about how I arrived at this reading, I just want to point out that once you insert the word justly, the verse is really transformed. Before you add justly, the verse is this kind of very confusing, incoherent statement about that seems to be denying the historicity of the crucifixion. But once you add the word justly, the verse makes perfect sense. It's coherent, it's lucid, and it's morally insightful. It's an insightful statement about the morality of the crucifixion. And not just that, it's also highlighting the moral dilemma that the crucifixion of Jesus places Jews in. The sort of the difficulty that Jews have in trying to justify and explain this event. So I'm now just going to talk briefly about how I arrived at this reading. The details are in the article. So I would encourage you to read the article if you want to know how I arrived at this reading. In this slide, I'm just going to give a quick summary of that. So the first thing that I've done is that I've read the Quran without the bias of the Muslim tradition. So if you read the article, you will notice that there are no references to classical Muslim commentaries at all. The article relies only on the primary sources for Islam, that is the Quran, the biographies of the Prophet, and the Hadiths. And this is the biggest obstacle that people have when they read this article or when they talk to me about this issue. It's letting go of the Muslim tradition. Because as I showed in that paradigm at the beginning, most people, whether Muslim or non-Muslim, believe that the traditional Muslim clerics are the authorities on the Quran, that they understand the Quran better than anyone else. And so if they say that this is what the verse means, then that's what the verse means. It's very difficult to break free from that and say, well, actually, why don't I read the Quran for myself and come to my own conclusion about what it means? And so this is a really important point, reading the Quran in historical context, imagining that you've traveled through time to the 7th century and none of the traditional Muslim literature even exists. And you're living in a time before that's even appeared on the scene. And all you have to go on is the sort of biographical information about the Prophet and the Quran. Now, the second thing that I've done is that I've read the verse in the context of the Quran as a whole. So not reading it in isolation, but fitting it into the context of the whole Quran. Now, this is harder to do because what it means is you have to read the whole book. You have to read the entire Quran and then form opinions about what are the major themes in this book, what are the major features of style. So this requires a bit more effort to actually interpret verses within the wider context of the whole book. But if you do that, then you notice a number of features. So first of all, the Quran has a very clear and repetitive style. The Quran is about 14 centuries old, so it's quite an ancient book. But despite that, it's surprisingly accessible to the modern day reader. It has a very clear and direct style of expression. It's not like reading an academic paper. Academic papers often have a sort of difficult vernacular, and you have to spend quite a bit of time deciphering what the author is trying to say. You don't encounter that problem with the Quranic text. The other thing about the Quran is that it has a repetitive style. So very much like the Torah, the Quran repeats important ideas again and again and again so that they are not lost on the reader. Now, why is this relevant for the crucifixion verse? Well, it's relevant because if the crucifixion verse were denying the historicity of the crucifixion, then that would be a major revelation for people in the 7th century. And you would expect that point to be repeated again and again. That's what you would expect just from a stylistic point of view. Now, the second point in this section is that, and now Martin's going to get upset with me for saying this, but in my view, the Quran affirms the earlier books, the Torah and the Gospel, as we have them today. Now, the reason that Martin might be uncomfortable with that statement is that Martin has spent a lot of time studying traditional Muslim views of the Bible. And the traditional Muslim view is that the texts that we have, the Torah and the Gospel as we have them today, are corrupted texts. They're not reliable. That is the traditional Muslim view. It's been held for a long time. And what I'm saying here is that if you read the Quran without the bias of the Muslim tradition, I believe you will see that the Quran is actually affirming these books. And I'm happy to sort of go through that in more detail in the Q&A. The third thing I would say about the Quran is that it has a focus on morality. So the Quran describes itself as the criterion, al-Furqan, the criterion for distinguishing right from wrong. So the Quran has a heavy focus on morality. It's not a history book. So the Quran tells us lots of stories from the past, but these stories are not told for the purposes of entertainment, nor are they told for the purposes of correcting factual errors in earlier versions of the story. The Quran is not concerned with that sort of thing. The Quran is telling these stories for the purposes of moral instruction. And why is that important when it comes to the crucifixion verse? Because the crucifixion verse is a single verse, and that means it's much more likely that the verse is addressing the morality of the crucifixion rather than re-educating people in the facts of that event. And that is also suggested by the fact that the verse is addressed to Jews and not Christians. If it was about the historicity of the crucifixion, it ought to have been addressed to Christians, but it's not. It's addressed to Jews. And then thirdly, there are historical reasons for adopting the reading that I have suggested. And these historical reasons correspond to reasons that historians cite for the origin of the Trinity being after Jesus and not with Jesus. So I'll show that with the examples. So first of all, there was a lack of controversy over the crucifixion in early Islam, and certainly in the Prophet's lifetime. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean that nobody challenged the Prophet on the issue of crucifixion denial. Now, nowadays, crucifixion denial is an obvious line of attack for anyone engaged in polemics against Islam, whether it's a Christian polemicist or an atheist polemicist. Crucifixion denial is an obvious point of weakness in the Muslim tradition from a non-Muslim point of view. So why didn't the Prophet's Jewish, Christian, and pagan opponents attack him on this point? Why didn't they criticize him for this? So a similar argument, as I said, is used by historians when it comes to the Trinity. If Jesus and his disciples were preaching a radically new way of understanding the nature of God, why didn't that cause controversy among monotheistic Jewish communities in the first century? So it's the same type of argument. There's another way that I have of expressing this argument. So what we have to remember is that in the Medinan period, the Prophet Muhammad had risen to power. So by the end of his life, he was the king of the Hijaz. which is the western portion of the Arabian Peninsula. He was a very important political figure by this point in time. And so an appropriate analogy would be, imagine what would happen if a modern day political leader, the prime minister of a country or the president of a country, imagine what would happen if such a person stood up and announced publicly that he was a Holocaust denier, that he denied the historicity of the Holocaust. So I'm sure you would understand that that would cause enormous controversy, especially among Jews. Jews would be absolutely outraged by that. And it's impossible that they would not react. So in the same way, if the Prophet Muhammad, who was a major political figure in the Medinan period, stood up and publicly announced that he was rejecting the historicity of the crucifixion of Jesus, it makes absolutely no sense that Christians would not have a problem with that at all, that it wouldn't cause any outrage or offense among Christians. So it's very difficult to explain this lack of controversy with the traditional Muslim reading. The second historical point is that when we look at crucifixion denial in early Muslim writings, we can identify when it originated and then how it was later elaborated. So it doesn't appear in Muslim writings until at least 100 or 200 years after the death of the Prophet, and then it is elaborated. So it's the same kind of argument that historians use about the Trinity, that it appears in later Christian writings in the 2nd century, and then it's elaborated. And from a historical point of view, that suggests that these ideas came later, that they did not originate with Muhammad or Jesus, respectively. So I'm finishing my presentation with the same diagram that I had up at the beginning. And so, you know, what I'm hoping is that this presentation and the article that I've shared will damage your confidence in the paradigm on the left and make the paradigm on the right more appealing. And if that is the case, if you are interested in this paradigm on the right, then I would be very happy for you to contact me. My email address is on there. And I can share more of my content with you and guide you in using this paradigm. And I just want to finish with the point that I made during the presentation, that for me personally, this has been a very revealing exercise. That you know, when I used to read the Qur'an through the lens of the Muslim tradition, I used to find it confusing. I used to find it very troubling and difficult to understand. As soon as I removed that lens and started reading the Qur'an in context, the sort of the beauty and the wisdom of the Qur'an started to come to the fore, as I tried to illustrate with the crucifixion verse, how that is transformed into a very insightful and incisive statement about the crucifixion and about Jews in relation to the crucifixion. So I'm going to stop there.